So in my last lecture, I was ending it on talking about how, from an outside perspective by scribes in the past, ancient Israel may have simply been incorporated into what they were writing when they were referring to Canaan or Canaanite. And so this may have also helped kind of, in our case, make it a little bit more confusing or difficult to know, if something's being referred to Canaanite or ancient Israel. And just to mention, there's a textbook I read when I was in undergraduate school called The Invention of Ancient Israel, The Silencing of Palestinian History. And Keith W. Whitelam wrote this book where he basically feels that scholarship has been so favorable to the biblical story that the ancient Canaanite history that we incorporate and talk about as a Palestinian religion and culture has been marginalized and has skewed the way that we look at ancient Israel and Canaan itself. My professor of my ancient Israel class felt the guy went too far, but it's debatable. And this kind of goes back down to what we see on page 66, where so many scholars debate about the origins of ancient Israel. Now, here's what's interesting, and let me just quickly tell you the biblical story and where the scholarship now kind of is at odds with. So in the biblical story, for those of you who haven't heard it, or to remind you, those who have heard it, Jews become slaves in ancient Egypt. They are oppressed there. We have one Jewish boy who gets raised by Pharaoh's daughter and becomes a part of the royal court of Egypt. Moses, when he's older, watches Hebrew slaves being abused. He attacks a fellow Egyptian and then he kills him, perhaps accidentally. And now he's a murderer, so he flees. He flees Egypt. And he spends many years living as a shepherd, an old shepherd. And at some point, God appears to him in a burning bush and wants to send him to go free the Hebrew people. And so Moses ends up going with his brother Aaron to the court of Pharaoh and pleads on behalf of the people in the name of God. Pharaoh obviously says, "I'm not letting my slaves go. Are you kidding me?" So then God has Moses show miracles, and God does miracles, and all these plagues, 10 plagues, are put on ancient Egypt to make the Pharaoh bow down and let the Hebrew people go. And he still doesn't do it, and only after the 10th plague, when it's all too much, he says, "Okay, fine, go." And the Jews then leave, but then the Pharaoh changes his mind. He feels humiliated, he's angry, he brings his army, and then the Jews are stuck by the Red Sea. God parts the Red Sea in a miracle. The Jews go through it. Pharaoh is following with his armies behind. And what happens? The Red Sea crashes down and kills the Egyptian army and Pharaoh, saving the Jewish people, the ancient Hebrew people. And God then leads them through Sinai desert to the wilderness with Moses and Aaron and Joshua, and there's all sorts of things that happen in that time period. But they're the idea is that they are being led to the promised land. And where's the promised land? They're going to go through the desert, and they're going to go to a fertile region known as Canaan in the Bible. This is where it says Canaan. Okay. Now it's full of all these people there. And God says, as we kind of saw in the language of Book of Numbers and in the readings on Holy War, to kill off all the Canaanites, women and children included, that they're so immoral according to God, and that he is going to give this land flowing full of milk and honey to the Jewish people. And prior to that, let me say, on Mount Sinai, God makes a pact with the Jews that there's a covenant. This is the story. And so they have to follow the commandments of God, and yet he will bless them. And one of the blessings is to eradicate and do ethnic cleansing on Canaan. So this is the traditional, literal, biblical story. No matter what translation you get, that is a straightforward story. Now, modern scholarship looks at ancient Israel, their language, their archaeological finds, and everything seems to indicate that the ancient Israelites were actually Canaanites, or a part of Canaanite culture. And this is a consensus on a good amount of scholars, even some who still claim to be religious Christians and religious Jews, although not of the Orthodox or evangelical fundamentalist type. Because this is just what it seems, and there's not really any proper records in the Egyptian histories to tell a story that has been told. Now, what's strange about this, you think if you want to make a claim that you have a right to land, saying that you're an invader who kills off the population isn't usually with the argument that you would make. Most of the time, people say we have a right to a particular land because we are the original inhabitants of this land, not the invaders. But in this case, that's what the Bible argues. Archaeological evidence seems to show that it's a very different story. So then the question would be, so let's just for a moment say, so first of all, let's say this. We could find later information in the archaeological record or some other story that verifies the biblical story. So I should just clarify that. On the other hand, if the biblical story is not true, then what's going on here? The book gives like several guesses or interpretations on possibly why. I'm not going to cover that much more than what you saw in the book. It's just good to realize that that's the debate that takes place regarding the origins. And as I keep saying, the further we go back, the less we know, and it becomes harder to figure out what's going on. So the book of Joshua, where it tells the story of Israel conquering Canaan, is contradicted by current historical reconstructions. And so, I mean, if you look at the book of Joshua, Joshua is who takes over after Moses dies, okay? And the whole entire story of the book of Joshua and the Bible is this story of conquering Canaan, or Canaan. And it's interesting, by the way, that's my first name. My parents were pacifist Christian hippies, and they named me after the most militaristic biblical character. I mean, go figure, right? Anyways, just let me point that out. All right, so that's where we're at currently. So it appears that a part of Canaanite culture is what they were, not separate. Just for example, as you see in the text, it mentions this. El was a Canaanite god. And in Hebrew, God is often referred to as El. Many might have heard of the term Bethel, house of God, Beit El. Okay, you have it in the names of people like Elijah. El is God. Eli in Hebrew is my God. Yah is Yahweh, which we'll talk more about. Eliyahu, my God is Jah, or the anglicized form, Elijah. Okay, so El was a Canaanite god. Now, what it appears, as the textbook says, is that there was a fusion between some of the Canaanite language for God, such as El, and then bringing in Yahweh, a name for God, also. Okay, so actually, I want to talk more about this fusion of the Hebrew words for God that come out of Canaanite religion, and then a name given to God, and the implications of that. So I'm going to end this right here, and I'll return to this slide.